I have something really important to say at the start, which is Taraporevala.
All
right? I practiced. So welcome. I wanna get a show of hands. How many of you in the room, I was gonna say women, it's mostly women at this point, but how many of you in the room sit on a public or private company board?
We raise our hands.
Okay, small group, yes, please raise your hands. There's like 7 or 8 boards represented up here, by the way. How many of you know a board qualified woman or consider yourself to be a board qualified woman? Okay, so I want to start by saying we're going to talk about whether or not there is in fact a pipeline problem. I think we got some of the answer there. And here to discuss that and everything else related to why there are only 12% of the people on Fortune 500 boards women. We have a great group of people. Why and what we're going to do about it. We have Debbie Lee, who is the CEO and Chairman Emeritus at BET, on the board of Marriott and Twitter currently. We have Pat Russo, who has been a CEO, I think 3 times, is currently a chair of HP Enterprise and sits on 3 other boards in addition to that. And we have Cyrus, who is the president and CEO of State Street Global Advisors, which is the investment arm of State Street Corporation. So let's get right into it. Debbie, I want to start with you, and I want to ask, I was very struck that in the course of a weekend, CBS named, I think, 6 new directors, 50% of which were women, in the wake of Les Moonves stepping down. Given how quickly that went and that half those board members were women, I want to ask you, does it take a crisis to make that kind of progress, and why aren't we seeing more progress quickly?
Well, I would say it usually does take a crisis to make companies do the right thing. I shouldn't be so blunt about that. But one, I think a couple of things were happening in the CBS case. I think, first of all, they knew Sherry Redstone, who's the vice chair and daughter of the founder of Viacom, which owns, Viacom and CBS, she knew this was coming. So I'm sure she had board candidates in the works. She wanted to revamp that board for a long time. She also revamped the board of Viacom. While I was still there, Viacom owned BET, and she revamped that board, and part of what she did at Viacom was put more women in. So I just think, having a woman making those decisions, and even though the board had to approve it, helped a little bit. I think it's just a matter of whether companies really want to do this. And I've been on boards for over 20 years. I've seen some progress, clearly not enough. When you look at the numbers, the 12% number, and the fact that there are still companies that don't have any women in the United States. There are some companies with 1 woman. We need to really focus on this. And we had a working session this morning, which was quite lively, where we came up with some suggestions. But we need CEOs, boards, and search firms who are committed to doing this. And whether it takes government involvement is a whole nother question. As you may know, California just passed something that hasn't been signed by the governor, but they passed a bill saying that all companies should have at least 1, and then they went up in number depending on the size of the company. But we have to do something, and I think if nothing else, and I think we learned a lot from the Me Too Time's Up movement, but one thing it taught us is that we need more women everywhere.
Yeah.
We need more women in the Senate room, clearly today. We need more women in C-suite positions. We need more women making decisions on movies and TV shows and all kind of things. And we need more women in the boardroom. That's the only way we're going to shift the burden of power and not allow the kind of things we've been hearing about for the 18 months to continue to happen. So we have to do it now. We have to stop talking about it and get it done. And it can be done. And there are boards that have half women and 30–40% women.
So Pat, you run to that point specifically. You run nominating and governance, I think, for GM.
I do for GM.
So how do you get to a different outcome?
Look, I think this is obviously difficult to do, but you just have to do it. So as I look at the boards with which I've been involved, which, you know, is General Motors, it was Alcoa, it was Hewlett Packard, Merck, where I've either served on the governance committee or chaired the governance committee or been the chairman or been a lead independent director, I went back and looked at, by name, how many women have I been involved with helping to place on the board opportunities that resulted from either the evolution, for example, of the GM board, or the creation of separate companies, HP, HPE, Alcoa, Arconic, and it numbered 20. And so I think it is a matter of being committed, not accepting that there are not candidates. That is just not the case.
You saw the show of hands.
It's just, it is not the case. Maybe you have to open your aperture a bit around criteria. If your criteria is every female board member has to be a CEO or a former CEO, that is not going to happen. The math just does not work. It's all about relevance and skills to the strategy that the company has and what they're trying to get done. And I just don't accept that there aren't plenty of women available. You just have to be committed, and you have to say, no, I don't like that slate. I want a slate that's more diverse. And, you know, I think you just do it. We have 5 women on the GM board. We have 5 women on the Hewlett Packard Enterprise board. We have 3 women on the Merck board.
Yeah.
Well said. I want to, Cyrus, get you into the conversation because you play an important role here. State Street does as an asset manager, and you've been very vocal. We all saw the statue coming in, Fearless Girl, but you've been vocal about the pressure that an asset manager can exert. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, so as one of the largest asset managers in the world, 2.7 trillion, third largest asset manager in the world, we believe that the very foundation of a well-run company starts with an effective, independent, and diverse board. And without that, a whole lot of other stuff just doesn't happen. So 2 years ago, we raised our voice, and starting in 3 countries, now 5, to companies that had no women on their boards. 0, not exactly the highest bar. So US, UK, Canada, Japan, and Australia, and we said, if we don't see progress, we're going to vote against you. So that was 2 years ago. I'm pleased actually, today we just announced, after 2 rounds of proxy voting, 2 seasons, so to speak, 300 of those companies have added at least 1 woman to the board, and another 28 have committed to adding. So that's the good news. So about a 25% have. The depressing news is that leaves another 75% to go. But you know, start with the Russell 3000, so the 3,000 companies in the US. When we started raising our voice, it was 24% of companies in 2016 did not have a single woman on the board. Today, that number is 16%. That is progress. That is the power of capitalism. That is the power that we, along with all asset managers and all asset owners, need to wield. And just to be clear, this is, I'm going to come at this just a little bit differently. To us, this is not about a feel-good. This is not about social justice. This is not about values. This is about value. Right? There's an MSCI study, 2015. Companies with more women in senior leadership positions have a return on equity of 10.1%. Those that don't have a return on equity of 7.4%. That is a 36% differential in your ROE. So this to us is about value. It's about being a fiduciary. And this is one of those great places where we don't need to compete with other asset managers and asset owners. We can do this together. There's about 70 to 80 trillion of professionally managed money in the world. We're 2.7 trillion. Since we raised our voice on this issue, 15 trillion in total have now joined this cry. And I think there's real power here.
That's a lot of power. Capitalism has a lot of power, and the data has a lot of power. America said last night, for people who were here, but it's the sort of human story, what happens person to person. I think Stacey Brown Philpott said that this morning as well.
Right.
Debbie, I want to ask you, Cyrus mentions 300 companies that had no woman now have a woman because of pressure from asset managers. Is one woman enough to get us to the benefit of diversity?
No, absolutely not. And I've been in too many situations where I'm the only woman. And I think it was Diversity Inc. or someone did a study years ago that said you need at least 3 women on a board before women feel comfortable. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but it's the more the better. Like Pat, I'm on the Twitter board. We now have 4 women. We just had our first international board member, who's a woman from Nigeria, Nkosi, who's amazing. She's been to 1 board meeting. She already changed the tone of the board meeting. She started talking right away. So a lot of board members wait.
Kara Swisher took some credit for that this morning from the 10 white men.
Oh, really?
3 years ago, who did the Twitter.
And I'm on the Marriott board. We have 4 women. You know, it should be, as we talked about in our, I was on a working group session this morning, we should be aiming for 50%. I mean, that's what we are of the population, and why is that not achievable? Pat mentioned a good point. You have to get rid of the definition of you're only looking at CEOs. That kind of went out of the window after Sarbanes-Oxley years ago, where
CFOs.
Government said,
CFOs.
guys, you can't keep putting your golfing buddy on boards. That's not good governance. You need a search committee. You need to, you know, add diversity. So that kind of went out the window. I mean, it's been expanded to looking for financial people, CFOs, international people, technologists. So there are, depending on where a company is and what they need, you know, the definition has changed. But it's incumbent upon the heads of nominating governance, which I am for Twitter. I used to be at a Kodak, a company where Pat was COO for a while. I was really proud of that. You have to push for it. And the board members have to push for it. The CEO has to. I love the fact that, you know, as an asset manager, you're asking about it. That helps. You know, we just need to do everything we can to change it. It's no excuse these days for a company not to have any women on the board, or just to have one.
Or just have one, right? So let me ask Pat and Cyrus, on pushing for it, how do you think about the notion of term limits or board refreshment? I think Cecile talked about the power of the patriarchy and lots of folks not wanting to step off and make room. How do you both think about that in this context?
I'll start. And again, I'm only referencing the experiences that I've had, but board evolution is really important. It's important as strategies get developed and refined, and then you determine what skills and experience will be helpful around the board table to help support management as they execute the strategy. And we all know there's a lot of disruption going on in many, many industries. And so one of the drivers of board evolution, I think, today is what are the skill sets that are needed, but boards have to step up to make sure that they're proactively managing board refreshment. That is not easy to do, right? It is not easy to do, but it gets done. It needs to be done carefully and respectfully. But I've been involved in some of that. I've been fortunate in that the boards on which I've served, I mean, 2 large companies split, and that creates a huge opportunity to staff boards. And then with spin-outs and divestitures, another opportunity to participate in evolving the board. So for the boards on which I sit, we really haven't had an issue of been there 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, the average tenure on the boards that I'm on is pretty low.
Yeah. You're making a big point about corporate evolution itself as playing an important role here.
Right. Yeah, you can't have a board that's static and a company that's trying to evolve and change. Right. The board makeup and relevance has to move with the company, which implies that you're going to have to make some changes to the board before somebody ages out or has to resign for other reasons.
Don't wait for it. Yes, Cyrus, I think
we're big fans, and I'd echo Pat's point, which is we believe in board refreshment. In the US, it's actually not so bad. Most boards either get elected every single year or once on a staggered basis once every 3 years for a given board member. It's a real problem in parts of Europe. In Germany, the whole board stands for election once every 5 years. Well, it's really hard to make a lot of change if you can only have an episode once every 5 years to make any change. And I think it's Pat's point is the world is evolving so fast and the skills required are evolving so fast. So whether it's for innovation or new skill sets that are more important, we're big fans of needing constant refreshment.
Can I add to that? Even though a lot of boards are elected every year or staggered years, it's still the norm, I think, in corporate America, where a lot of boards, directors stay on until they're 72.
Yes.
Or 74,
or older.
or 70, or older. And if you go on a board when you're in your 30s, that's most of your life. So I think it's important. Term limits have become a popular topic, and some boards are going to term limits. And 10 years is usually the norm for that. So a lot of companies are now talking about that, but it's still unusual. So unless someone steps down for some reason, you don't really have a lot of turnover. I think with technology being popular right now, and people looking for directors that have technology experience, those board members are coming in at a younger age. This morning, again, in the working group, we talked about, is it 10 years, is it 5 years? I think 5 years is tough because it really does take you about 2 or 3 years to learn a company.
Yeah.
There's a big learning curve, but I think 10 may be the way we're heading.
Pat, let me ask you, with that in mind, and to the women in the room, what advice would you give someone coming up the ranks, particularly from underrepresented minorities on boards, women, people of color? What advice would you give to actually get on a board? I'll ask both of you that, since 6 boards between you right now.
Yeah. So first of all, I think one of the things that boards like is kind of a track record of producing results, right? So being in roles and positions where outcome can be measured, because if you think about what is one of the roles of you as a board member, it's about figuring out how to create value for shareholders. They care a lot about that. And so somewhere along the way, being able to relate what you've done and how that translates into value creation, I think is important. That's sort of in your own, what do you have to offer? Secondly, I think networking is really important. I think the more you can reach out to people who sit on the boards of your companies, make sure they understand you might be interested, utilizing your HR resources, making sure they understand there's an interest, because that's, a lot of that is the way it happens. Making sure you know who some of the search folks are who are big in board placement, and we all know who they are, so get on their radar screen. Because it's just not going to happen. Somebody's not going to show up and knock on your door and say,
Can I press on that, Debbie? Does it happen differently for men?
Yes, it happens very differently for men. I think I told the story earlier today. I knew of someone who retired from a company, and he was CEO, and he just made 5 calls to 5 CEOs and said, "I'm retiring. I want to do board service." And next thing you know, he was on the board. I mean, that's unusual, but that's still some of the good old boy network that's left over. What Pat said is very true. You have to. If you're at a company, first of all, you got to work your way up the ranks of the company. You have to be in the C-suite or close to the C-suite.
Right.
Then after that, you have to let people know that you're interested. And whether it's people at search firms, because they keep running lists, whether it's people you meet through networking. The first board I was asked to join, I was referred by the CEO of my company because he had too many boards. So he said, well, I have a COO, why don't you take a look at her? And that worked out. And then the truth, it's true what they say, once you get on one board, it's easier, because then you do have a track record, and your name circulates because you meet other people on the board who are on other boards. I mean, I've had several fellow board members ask me if I'm interested in things. So, and first of all, make sure you're not at a company where they tell you can't serve on boards. Because
find that out
yeah,
first.
there are some companies like that.
That's a great point. I want to, Cyrus, give you a question on that, and then I'll go to the room. So think of your questions now. Do you think there's a sufficient understanding in sort of the public at large, and even people coming up the ranks in companies, as to what purpose boards really serve and what board service actually means? And if not, like, what do we do about that?
I hope there's an understanding about what boards' purpose is, which is mainly to be the voice for shareholders, represent shareholders, and really focus on the long-term strategy and make sure that the management, and there is a separation and distinction of roles and responsibilities, which is really important, but that management is focusing on all of the right both strategies and other actions to create long-term shareholder value. That's what it's about.
It's great. So we'll take one or two questions from the room, if there are any. And if
can I just add, from an executive point of view, one of the benefits of serving on boards is you see how other CEOs do it. When I was a COO and expecting to be CEO one day, I learned from other CEOs. I just watched them, how they handled, human resources questions, how they handled audits, or government. I mean, it's just if you didn't happen to go to MBA school like I did, it's a great way to see how others do it. And it helps you be a better executive. It really does. And I'm surprised that some companies don't understand that. I mean, Mel Karmazin, who used to run Viacom, is like, why are you on boards? I don't pay you to be on boards. I pay you to run BET. Well, that's cute, but it's...
You're making the opposite argument, that every CEO should be thinking, how do I get my whole executive team?
And if they want to restrict it to one or two, especially if you're in a CEO position, that's understandable.
Yeah.
But, good CEOs realize that it's helpful to executives to see.
And it's a real broad, as you said, Deborah, it's a real broadening experience.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
If your CFO is serving on another, one other board, obviously, they get a perspective and see how another company does something, bring back good ideas, share best practices. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Right.
That's
you just said to me earlier that one of Mary Barra's strengths in becoming the CEO of GM was her external mindset and the ability to understand what was going on outside of GM. I think we had a couple questions, one right back here.
Hi, my name's Marcy. Thanks, a great panel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you talked about informal networks, and I know for me, informal networks played a big role in me becoming a board member. And obviously, the asset management firms are now playing also a big role, which is fantastic. What obligation do you believe search firms play, especially the big ones, in identifying and advocating for strong women candidates for boards? Thanks.
Well, I think they have a big responsibility. One time I didn't hire a search firm because they told me they didn't think I told them I was interested in a black male for a particular board, and they said, well, there are not very many black male CEOs. And I was like, well, if that's your attitude, I'm not going to hire you because you're clearly not listening to what I'm saying. So I think it's incumbent upon board members to push and CEOs, but search firms should push also. And even if not asked, provide a diverse slate and help the companies understand how beneficial it is to have a diverse board and how much it affects and improves company performance.
Cyrus, you first.
I just click that down. It's not just board roles. I think search firms need to be pushing for diverse slates for all roles, right? There is a pipeline effect here, and if we're going to wait all the way for the board piece, it's way too late.
You know, at the risk of being the skunk at the picnic,
panels are much more interesting.
No, I mean, look, I think the reality is, I don't know whether they feel like they have an obligation or they should have an obligation. Here's what I know. Everybody wants diverse candidates. So if you're running a search firm and you don't have a good practice that identifies diverse candidates, you're not competitive. So whether it's obligation or competitiveness, they are doing it. I'm sure they know that it's the right thing to do and all these other things, but fundamentally, if you're a search firm that's not producing qualified, diverse candidates, you're not going to have a lot of business.
I talked to a search firm a couple of months ago that specialized in placing women, people of color, and LGBT members on board. That's the first time I've ever heard LGBT, the LGBT issue raised as members of a board, but it's something we should be thinking about. I mean, we talked about making LGBT members feel more comfortable at companies. Why shouldn't we look for them to be on a board? So.
And you know, there are search firms. I happen to know of one woman came from Goldman Sachs. She's been in business for the last 25, 30 years. All she does is women on boards. And she's got pretty good practice.
I think I saw one more hand right over here. This will be the last question.
Hi, Betsy Bagley from Catalyst, and I appreciate your talking about diverse slates and the importance of having multiple diverse candidates on those slates. But there are also challenges to moving women off the slates to being the ones selected as the directors. And I'm wondering if you can talk about either some of the ways that some of the bias that you've seen against those candidates and how we evaluate qualifications differently depending on the package that it comes in, and then also the successes you have had in getting those women to be the ones that are selected.
I'm just thinking about, you know, in the cases that I've been involved in, what we start with is what skill sets and experiences are we looking for? Give you an example and I'll use Hewlett Packard HP Inc. When we were separating the companies. The printing and personal computer business, we said, you know, this is a business that is really going to be doing a lot more in 3D printing. Material science would be really helpful in, you know, strategically in supporting their efforts. And Stephanie Burns, who happened to have been in that industry, was a great candidate. So you start with what do you need? You look at a set of candidates that have that background. You want some diverse candidates. You test for cultural fit, collaboration, style. You know, you do your vetting, and then you select. So, you know, I think it's part of a process. And if you're committed to diversity because you believe, as Cyrus says, it's not about the altruism of it. Business decisions are better debated with better outcomes when diverse opinions are sitting around the table, hands down all the time. And so if you believe that, and the people that I've worked with believe that, then you just make it happen.
Yeah. And I think once you get a woman in the room or a person of color, it's hard to lay out obstacles because we're going to push back against that. So maybe because we're in the room, I don't hear as much of that. The boards I'm on every other year or every year, we kind of look at what the board looks like, the number of women, number of people of color, and that goes into the search for what we're looking for next. You know, we may be looking for someone with an international background, but we always keep tabs on women and people of color. And there are great organizations like Catalyst, thank you for your work, I don't know if anyone's heard of the board list, but that's in the tech industry where a woman started it, and she gets recommendations from male and female CEOs and creates a list so that if you hear a man, I heard there was one this morning, who said he couldn't find any females for his board. If you hear that, you can say, here's a list of 200, you know, go at it. I joined the Time's Up movement, and the board, I mean, the committee I went on was the committee to get more women on boards, because I said it's so important to stop sexual harassment and abuse. And so they took the board list model and have now taken it into the media business.
Yeah.
And I called, you know, a couple of male CEOs and females and said, just give me the names of your best executives, because we're making a list. Now it gets back to the question that someone raised about how do you get people from the list to be an actual director, and that takes pressure on the companies. But there has been some movement, but we just need to do more.
And I think you end us on get women in the room, and that begets getting women and other underrepresented minorities in the room. So Cyrus, Pat, Debbie, thank you so much, and thank you all. It is now my job